Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Partial Historians presentation. So, my name is Roberto. I will be helping with tech support and moderating the chat.
Excellent. All right. An airy question, the thorny problem of the Augustan succession. Success in ancient Rome was never a given. You could die in war, lose your land to pesky invaders, and you could be the last of your family line, effectively dooming your family's reputation to the dustbin of the has-beens. Family planning was very important to the Roman elites. Families were the first building block of Rome's political structure. Being born into a great family might have been luck, but once you were out of your swaddling pants, you needed to start learning how to represent the family values. The Julian clan is perhaps the most famous family to come out of ancient Rome. Thanks to Julius Caesar and his adopted heir, Gaius Octavius, better known now as Augustus. Caesar and Augustus have left an indelible mark on history, yet there was an area where they were helpless: procreation. Caesar would have had no need to adopt Augustus if he had managed to have a biological son. Infant and child mortality was an ongoing issue in the ancient world. There was disease, illness, wounds. All of these were made more challenging in the ancient world than they were today. So this puts into context the very real challenges Roman families faced as they vied for their place in the halls of eternal fame. So Caesar had some bad luck finding an heir, but it didn't quite match Augustus's experiences. As Augustus's career developed, he began to see the potential for not only an heir to his family, but the potential for a political dynasty. He planned to forge this dynasty with his formidable wife, Livia. She was the daughter of Marcus Livius Drusus and Cornelia, but she gained her connection with the super elite Claudian gens from her first marriage to Tiberius Claudius Nero in 42 BCE. Together, Augustus and Livia became responsible for the Julio-Claudian family and some of the most notorious Roman emperors. So the big picture of this all is that they get their dynasty, but it certainly did not go the way that Augustus wanted it to. History may have been very different if everything had gone to plan. So, welcome to the catalogue of Augustus's numerous failed plans for an heir.
That takes us to Plan A, knock her up. The political position that Augustus carved out for himself over the years was not something that could just be passed on. He was emphatically not a king. A dynasty might not have been his plan in the beginning, but he definitely wanted a son to pass on his family wealth and continue the patriarchal line. When he married Livia, let's just say she looked like a sure bet. And by that, we mean she was 6 months pregnant to another man. Augustus also had a child on the way with his own wife. It was fertile ground. However, in one of the most tragic twists, their union produced only a stillborn child. If there were no bubs in the future, Augustus could have divorced Livia and found someone else, but he didn't. Was this burning and eternal flame? Well, we don't have their diaries, but it seems like the real deal. Augustus's decision to stay with Livia in a childless union seems like a personal choice, but it actually changed the course of Roman history. With no son of his own, Augustus needed a backup plan.
This leads us to Plan B. Could a marriage do it? Marcus Claudius Marcellus, was born in 42. He was the son of Marcellus Sr. and Octavia, Augustus's sister. Being born into an elite Roman family meant that certain decisions were out of your hands. And by the time that Marcellus Jr. was about 3 years old, he was engaged to the daughter of Sextus Pompey. Yes, the infamous pirate. At the grand age of 13, Marcellus had the honor to be part of Augustus's triumph for his victory over Antony and Cleopatra. According to Suetonius, Marcellus rode the right horse of the triumphal team and Tiberius rode the left. They were both 13 years old. So Marcellus was on display in front of the crowds of Rome, no doubt a formative experience. By 25, the engagement to Sextus Pompey's daughter was off the cards and he was married to Augustus's daughter, Julia. Marcellus was 17 and Julia was 14. Julia was Augustus's daughter by his second wife, Scribonia. Julia's marriage to Marcellus immediately marked him out as a figure worthy of note. At just 17, Marcellus was now understood to be a very important figure, especially since Augustus had no son. Marcellus went from strength to strength. At age 18, he was designated aedile. This is huge. The Romans had a specific career ladder, the cursus honorum, and each position came with a minimum age. Young men would start out vying for the position of quaestor, minimum age, 31, then aedile, minimum 37, before going on to be praetor, age 40, and finally consul at around about age 42. So Marcellus was entering his political career way up the career ladder and at less than half of the minimum age required. We think Augustus liked him. And this was just the start of fancy honors for Marcellus. He was also granted permission to apply for the consulship 10 years before the legal age. And so in 23 BCE, Marcellus is aedile, super young, doing his thing. And as appropriate, he organized games for Rome's citizens. He was bankrolled by Augustus, obviously. But then the unexpected happened. Marcellus took ill and died before completing his aedileship. So Marcellus might have been a rising star in Augustus's household, but his life was cut short. This must have been a blow. One of our closest sources to the period, Velleius Paterculus, notes that people thought that if anything should happen to Caesar, that is Augustus, Marcellus would be his successor in power.
And that brings us to Plan C, bromance over romance. Marcellus's abrupt exit was not the only issue that Augustus would face in 23 BCE. There was an aristocratic conspiracy, and the people of Rome also seemed very unsettled. And then there's the matter of Augustus's BFF, the Sundance to his Butch, the Pitt to his Clooney, the Brewstess with the mostess, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Agrippa and Augustus had known each other forever. They went so far back, we're not even sure how they met. There's a TV series in that. Agrippa's family background was so obscure, you need a detective dream team to figure it out. Augustus would not have been able to achieve the power that he did without Agrippa. It was Agrippa who had a knack for the administration of cities, but also, most importantly, a knack for military matters. Now, off the battlefield, Agrippa was loyal to a fault. But a hint of a storm cloud in this bromance came in 23 BCE. Before Marcellus's fatal illness, Suetonius tells us that Agrippa left Rome abruptly and headed for Mytilene. Perhaps he was involved in negotiations to retrieve the Roman standards that had been lost in Parthia, but perhaps it was something to do with Marcellus. Was Agrippa allowing Marcellus to have his moment? Or was he irritated that this young whippersnapper was being given preferential treatment? After everything he had done, we will probably never know what Agrippa's absence really meant or whether it had anything to do with Augustus's plans for succession. If it was a jealous tantrum, the other events of the year certainly got rid of that problem. Augustus himself fell dangerously ill in this year. Concerns about what might happen if he died contributed to the general unease in this year about the future. What we do know is that when Augustus was on death's door, he gave his signet ring to Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, not Marcellus. Augustus surprised everyone, including himself, I think, by recovering. He and Agrippa patched things up. Perhaps the ring did the trick. Thanks, Beyonce. The short-term future was assured, but what about the long-term? Dio preserved a comment from Maecenas, one of Augustus's allies, which is revealing even if it's not true. Augustus had made Agrippa so powerful that he was going to have to either kill him or make him his son-in-law. Augustus chose the latter, and Agrippa became Julia's second husband, which is not at all creepy, considering that he had given her away at her first wedding because Augustus was in Spain. Once again, Agrippa did not fail his friend. In spite of his many duties, Agrippa turned Julia into a slip-and-slide ride for Augustus. Augustus adopted the first two boys produced by this couple. However, Augustus knew all too well just how fragile his situation was. What if he were to die before they had the skills they needed to thrive in the post-Civil War political world? Would Augustus have counted on Agrippa to act as some kind of regent for the boys, or at least to steer the ship to ensure their future as leaders in Rome? Agrippa was granted tribunician and proconsular power in around 18 BCE, and this would last for 5 years, bringing him very close to Augustus in political standing. Whatever he intended for Agrippa, once again, Augustus's plans would be foiled. Agrippa died at the grand old age of around 50 or 51 in March of 12 BCE. And yet, by 12 BCE, things had changed for Augustus as well. His political position had solidified in a way that wasn't true even just 10 years previously. A dynasty where he could be succeeded by Gaius and Lucius, the sons of Agrippa and Julia, was looking far more possible, but only if he could raise them right, and they were still so young.
This leads us to plan D. Keep it in the family. Gaius and Lucius come as a pair in this paper, just as they were often treated as a pair by the ancient sources. Gaius was born in 20 BCE and Lucius in 17. So these are the sons, Julia and Agrippa. So after losing Marcellus, Augustus resolved to adopt his grandsons, Gaius and Lucius, in 17. This ensured that both the line of Agrippa and Augustus would go on to rule the Roman roost. After Agrippa's grumpy moment back in 23, Augustus seems to have entered into his fawning era, trying to make things up to Agrippa in a big way. So Gaius has the distinction of accompanying Augustus to Gaul when he was about 12 years old. And he was designated, wait for it, consul by the Senate before he was 20. Plus, he was named princeps iuventutis, first among the youth, and joined the Pontifical College. In 1 BCE, he married Claudia Livia Julia, the daughter of Livia's son Drusus, and then he was sent out east with Imperium Proconsulare, an extraordinary power for someone barely hitting their 20s. So like his brother, Lucius was also designated as consul at age 20 and also elected princeps iuventutis, and he joined the priestly college of the augurs, and he was engaged to Aemilia Lepida. Now, her parents are uncertain, but it seems likely that she was the granddaughter of the triumvir Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. So that's not a great marriage necessarily, but it's there. In 2 CE, so we flip over into the 1st century now, he headed out to Spain to bolster his military training. On the way, Lucius fell ill, and on the 20th of August, he died in Massalia in Gaul. His ashes were returned to Rome and placed in Augustus's mausoleum. Let's return to Gaius. Tragic end to Lucius, but let's move on. While out dealing with the kings of Parthia and Armenia, Gaius's forces become embroiled in a revolt. And on the 7th of September in 3 CE, Gaius was wounded in the field. He sought permission from Augustus to remain in Syria as a private citizen on account of his wounds, but Augustus wasn't about to leave his only remaining son at risk of being killed so far from home. He ordered Gaius to return to Rome. Dutifully, he complied. He made it as far as Lycia, which is in modern Turkey, before succumbing to his wound on the 21st of February in 4 CE. He was only 24 years old. Augustus ensured his ashes were returned to Rome and placed in his mausoleum. The loss of Gaius and Lucius in the space of 18 months was a terrible blow. Marcellus was dead, Agrippa was dead, Augustus's grandchildren Gaius and Lucius were dead. In terms of the Julian men in the family, that left only Agrippa Posthumus, Agrippa's final son. And this leads us to plan E. Last to be born, last to be adopted. Augustus did the needful and adopted Agrippa Posthumus in 4 CE. It doesn't last long for Agrippa Posthumus, though. He fell out of favor a couple of years later and was exiled.
And that takes us to Plan F, otherwise known as Operation Bridesmaid. And this is all about Tiberius, the man that Augustus never wanted, and yet the man that he got. Isn't that always the way? Tiberius was the eldest son of Augustus's wife, Livia, by her first marriage. He was your classic good on paper guy. He did what was asked, he did it well, but he was always the silver medal because he wasn't a Julian. So, for example, when Marcellus was married to Julia, Tiberius had wedded Vipsania, one of Agrippa's daughters. Now, he seems to have really adored her, but still, in terms of status, hello, Tiberius's marriage to the daughter of Augustus's BFF sent a clear signal. You're a Claudian, dude. However, by the time of Agrippa's death, Tiberius and his younger brother, Nero Drusus, were both experienced politicians and talented generals. They had grown up with Augustus, and quite frankly, he had no other choice. When Agrippa died, Julia was in her late 20s, certainly still able to have more of those all-important baby boys. To say that Tiberius was not interested is an understatement. Vipsania was his dream girl, and Julia may have already been his nightmare. She had a reputation for being wild, not an asset as far as someone as traditional as Tiberius was concerned. Plus, she was basically his sister. Ugh. But Augustus had determined that this plan was for the best, and so their fate was sealed. They took Tim Gunn's advice and tried to make it work. Julia accompanied Tiberius to his provincial command in Illyria. Before long, she was pregnant with a son. Could this child have been the heir? A mixture of Augustus and Livia in a baby at last? We don't know exactly what went wrong, but infant mortality was an unfortunate feature of life in the ancient world. The child did not live long. The next few years were rough for Tiberius. Not only did he lose his son, but also his beloved brother. Finally, something snapped. In 6 BCE, Tiberius threw all of his toys out of the pram and ran away to Rhodes to be a private citizen. Augustus was furious, but Gaius and Lucius were getting older. Did he really need Tiberius anymore? The plan evolved. Tiberius became extraneous until all of a sudden he wasn't. With the exile of Julia and the deaths of Gaius and Lucius in very short succession, suddenly Augustus was in his 60s and had no heir. Tiberius, now slightly more contrite, had to be allowed back to Rome. For all of Augustus's scheming and arranged marriages and careful sleight of hand, Tiberius, a man without a drop of Julian blood, would be the heir. Tiberius was adopted in June 4 CE, along with Agrippa Posthumus. When Posthumus was banished, Tiberius's position as heir became even stronger. The only failsafe Augustus could put in place to preserve the Julian line was to force Tiberius to adopt Germanicus, the son of his brother Nero Drusus and Antonia Minor, his niece via Octavia. Augustus would never know it, but this plan too would fail when Germanicus himself died just 5 years after Augustus. It would be 20 years before someone with Julian blood would assume his role. And wasn't that a smashing success?
So the events that followed with the Julio-Claudian emperors, the bitter infighting, the murder, the creepy marriages, the exiles, might never have happened if Augustus and Livia had had a son that survived. Or Marcellus didn't die, or Gaius, or Lucius, or Agrippa. If we can learn anything from this history, is that you can't just have a backup plan, you need at least 7. This situation leaves us with many questions. The very emergence of imperial rule as it was shaped by Augustus was highly unlikely. He was a minor relation of Julius Caesar. The political class of Rome would not have expected his rise to power. They were not prepared for the civil war that followed, and the rolling proscriptions of Antony Octavian reshaped the political scene. It is significant that patrilineal lines can be so fragile, and even more significant that patrilineal lines cannot exist without women. Augustus's daughter Julia is pivotal to understanding the situation. Without sons, every hope Augustus had for continuing his line rested with Julia. Elite Romans probably had no expectation of marrying for love. That wasn't what Roman marriage was about, but it had to have been challenging to be married repeatedly to men you knew very well. Marcellus was Julia's first cousin. They likely grew up together. Agrippa was a father figure in her life. That cannot have been ideal. Tiberius was of an age with Marcellus, but as Livia's son, he grew up in the same house as Julia. They were step siblings. And what, if any of these plans, besides the last, had succeeded? What would a Julian dynasty without the Claudians have looked like? What career heights would Marcellus have achieved if he had lived beyond 23? What kind of politics would have ensued if both Gaius and Lucius lived? Would that have been another Caracalla and Geta in the making? Would the position of emperor even have lasted? What if Agrippa Postuma had turned out to be a good kid rather than an alleged depraved oddball? For now, these are our airy questions.
And that's it, guys.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Thank you for coming to our paper.
Indeed. Yeah.
We're now ready for questions.
Indeed.
Alrighty, awesome. And we've actually had a few questions pop up during your presentation.
Woohoo.
Yeah, so the first question is, did Livia do it?
Now we really didn't mention her at all.
We did. We had to cut out so much.
But I think part of that is because I think maybe I'm just speaking for myself, so maybe I'll just do that. I don't think she did it. There seems really implausible ways for that to like sort of come about. We've got like Tacitus as a really highly negative source coming from about a century later, who really digs into Livia and sort of suggests that she poisons everybody. But the trouble with that is that surely Augustus is smart enough to know what is happening in his own household, one would hope. And it doesn't really do her any favors necessarily. There's still no guarantee. Tiberius is still the very last choice. Like Augustus goes out of his way to pick everybody else. So she must know the situation with her own son.
Yeah. Like I'm with you on that one. I kind of feel like it's one of those things that because of the murder and infighting that happens later, people might be reading backwards a little bit and thinking that, it makes sense for Livia to be acting in this way because the Julio-Claudian dynasty becomes such a cesspit and people do get murdered and that kind of thing. But yeah, I agree with Dr. G. Number one, when we start out on this journey, there's no guarantee that Augustus can actually leave his position to anyone. That's a massive gamble on his part. So the idea that she would be like killing people off, to try
Super
and make
early.
I don't think it adds up at all. And also, I mean, if she knew Tiberius, I mean, look, I love him, but he was not born to be emperor. So if she knew her son at all, she would have like pulled the plug because like he was going to do nothing but ruin the family name, as indeed he did.
Yeah, and I think Dr. Rad makes a really good point here in the sense that it's a really contentious political time, this late Republican shift that we see now becoming the Principate slowly but surely and turning into imperialism. The Romans would not have anticipated that while they were living it, for sure. This was a rolling succession of really bad political times. And it's not even till quite late in Augustus's life that he sort of sees things as this potential for maybe being dynastic in terms of passing on political power as well as just the family sort of like heirlooms or whatever. And so for Livia to be sort of back planning for that way earlier than what anybody would anticipate just seems to be a misreading of the potential evidence here.
Yeah. And I think also it's because, again, like in a situation like this where you get into dynastic times, it does highlight the women and their role in things. But again, I don't think that that's necessarily accurate for Livia and Augustus, at least in the early stages anyway. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. The next question we have is from Greta. How much of Julia's naughtiness was possibly bad press? I mean, all this ill befell procreation because she was such a bad girl.
She does cough a bad rap, doesn't she? I think there is a point where I think we see Julia shift, for sure. And it seemed plausible that that might be a reaction against the kinds of things that her father is putting her through. Like, she does some very dutiful stuff early in her life, like does all of the marriages, has all of these babies with Agrippa. And it gets to the point where they're like, well, now you got to be married to Tiberius as well. And I think that's like almost the moment where she throws in the towel, like, you got to be kidding. I mean, she's like, I know him so well. He's lame. I don't want to. And they're kind of like, you got to do it. You got to do it. And at some point, there's a breaking moment there for her where she's like, you know what? I don't think I have to do this anymore. I feel like I've done my job.
Yeah, it's such a weird situation because the details we have are just so tantalizing. It is so tempting to see what she ends up getting up to as like a political coup. But then it's Augustus himself who reveals it to everybody. It's just such a bizarre thing. And I just don't think we have enough of the pieces of the puzzle to be 100% sure. I think the only thing we can really be sure about with her was that she was definitely sleeping around by the time she got a bit older.
This one is once again from Luke. Was there any chance of a return to the Republic?
Ooh, it's really tough. And I think part of the reason why it's difficult to see a return to the public in a big sense is that what is the Republic by this stage? By the time we hit what is happening in 44 with the assassination of Julius Caesar, there has been a real uptick in personal politics and big figures in Roman politics for about the last 50 to 60 years. So your Sulla, your Marius, your Pompey, all of those figures are really standout figures who are doing stuff that sits outside what Republican expectations might suggest. So there's a sense that there's a fragility in what the Republic stands for in this last century anyway. And then the civil war that ensues after the assassination of Julius Caesar really puts everything into chaos. So much of the elite political class gets pushed out, killed, done over, have their property stripped away. By the time we see Augustus emerge as the most powerful figure, he has really cowered everybody who has been in that political class. There's only the yes men left. It's pretty bad. Could he restore the Republic? I mean, he says he's restoring the Republic, but I mean, do you believe him?
What Augustus says and what he does ain't the same thing, as we've talked about many times. But look, there are also, like, later on these little hints that it was possible. Like when Caligula is assassinated, there is this record of the Senate meeting and having this conversation about, well, who's going to be next? Who are we going to choose? And then there is one guy who apparently throws it out there. Maybe we bring back the Republic. But I kind of am with Tacitus on this side that, like, that's not going to happen by this point. Like, everyone's too institutionalized. Maybe like an evolution of what Augustus designed, which I think is what we see with the Julia Claudians. But yeah, I am very dubious about whether it was possible at that time. And there were lots of people who were genuinely, I think, afraid of what would happen if Augustus died. Even though there are conspiracies because people don't like him hogging all the power and they don't like what he's doing, there are also people that are clearly afraid of what will happen if he dies, and therefore they work towards supporting him, obviously. So, yeah.
Alrighty. Next one is from Sydney. About how old was Agrippa Posthumus when he fell out of favor? Was it solely his personality that was to blame?
It seems to be. That's the rumor. he seems to be some sort of debauched kind of kid. I don't know. So he's born the same year that Agrippa dies, so around about 12 BCE.
Yeah.
And he gets adopted in 4 CE. So that makes him around about, 16, 17.
Which is a while to wait. Augustus adopted Gaius and Lucius when they were a baby and a toddler. So it does sort of give rise to questions about, what's he waiting for? What did this toddler do? That was so offensive.
But it's only that moment after Gaius and Lucius die that he really considers, oh, well, there's that other kid as well. But it seems like it's literally 2 years between that adoption and then the exile of Agrippa Posthumus. And whatever he's done as a young kid, it has not impressed. So, and maybe that's not his fault. He's pretty young, but it's hard to say. It's never really explicated in heaps of detail. And then we have the unfortunate demise of Agrippa Postumus as soon as Tiberius does inherit. So he is considered a threat, clearly.
He's got that bloodline. Tiberius doesn't have it.
Ooh.
You might be a psycho, but he's still a Julian.
Yeah, look, I mean, it doesn't bode well for them, does it? Agrippa Postumus, weirdo. Caligula, weirdo.
But this is the thing, like yeah, everyone's obviously spilt a lot of ink over like what on earth was wrong with Agrippa Postumus. Like it's so we're just given so little to work with. It's hard to imagine. I just think that this must be exiling him as a teenager must be like the ancient Roman equivalent of like that American institution of like packing children off to military school, or those like boarding camps where there are TV shows and reality shows about like them, you know, getting whipped into shape.
Yeah, and he kind of had an easy life. So I think in terms of like thinking about like what has he gone through as a kid, like he's grown up without a dad.
Yeah.
His mum has been pretty wild in this period of her life, and she's also managed to get herself exiled.
Yeah.
So he hasn't had a really stable childhood upbringing.
No.
At all. So maybe it's not all his fault.
Exactly.
Poor guy.
I would just blame Augustus for, you know, because Augustus was pretty mad himself with like partying and all that, so, and debauchery. So I'll blame Augustus for being his, you know, role model in that regard.
Augustus never wants to talk about his party lifestyle from when he was young, though.
It's not just when he's young. I mean, there are those rumors, right, about the house filled with young virgins that Livia stocks for him.
I feel like this comes from Tacitus as well. I'm placing it as suspect.
So. I think it's Suetonius, and he's super reliable, as we all know.
The gossip mag of the ancient world is here for us.
Absolutely. Another question. Dr. G, are your books in rainbow order?
Yes. They certainly are. I clearly need more green and blue books, though, because like the black section, thanks academia for like making so many books black. But it'd be nice to have more color in here. But
then Austin also asks, what do you think about the theory that Augustus chose Tiberius to make himself look good?
I love the idea that he did that, but I kind of, as Dr. G's pointed out, Tiberius is literally his absolute last choice. And he clearly does not want him because he puts Germanicus in as his successor. And yeah, I think that is a sure indicator that he really didn't want Tiberius to take over. And particularly after Tiberius like self-exiled for a while, I think it was pretty clear to everybody that as much as Tiberius had a lot of talents, he found the politics side of things a bit difficult and the family side of things a bit difficult. And he was, you know, likely to have these sorts of tantrums again, as he did. So, yeah, I don't think Augustus looked at Tiberius and was like, yes, this is a man that can handle it.
Tiberius stands out as this like highly competent figure in some respects. Like he seems to be pretty at ease in a military command, pretty reliable out on the frontier and stuff like that. I think what Tiberius really isn't into is actual politics and that kind of hungry game that Augustus has been playing and winning since he was 19 years old. Like Augustus is a real political animal for sure. And Tiberius is kind of like, I'm happy to do the things. But when it comes to like his emotional regulation, when it comes to like being in the political scene, we see it almost instantly when he does come into the position and inherits that sort of imperial-esque power that's going to go on to become the emperorship, is that he tries to negotiate with the Senate to sort of split it up and work it out. And can we share this somehow? Like he really doesn't want to be in the spotlight in that kind of way. And those sorts of things, I mean, Augustus already knew he was like this. And as Dr. Rad was saying, the way that he goes and sort of self-exiles himself and just gets out of there early on. And then we see him do it again when he comes into power. So,
and also if Augustus would have known that even by the time he died, whilst his position was much more secure, it was still a massive gamble for him to be passing anything on. Like the idea, like it was so key that he had like a good person in place for that transition period, because it still could have all fallen apart. Somebody else could have been chosen that had nothing to do with the Julio-Claudian dynasty if they were going to stick with this whole like princeps kind of idea. It was absolutely so important for Tiberius to manage that well if it was going to get to that Julian line. If Germanicus was going to eventually end up taking over, Tiberius had to be capable of handling that. So I don't think Augustus chose him to make himself look good. I think he chose him because he thought he was competent enough to hold on to things and make sure that transition happened. And then I think the expectation was, because Tiberius is not a young man when Augustus dies, the expectation I think must have been that Germanicus would take over. Either Tiberius would have stepped back or he would have died and Germanicus would have taken over. But classic in terms of the theme of today, that isn't what happened.
Yeah, and Germanicus is very popular even as a young man. So he does have a sense of charismatic power that sort of encourages people to be interested in his life and what he's up to and what he's doing, and in a way that sort of Tiberius never seemed to be able to quite cultivate. And yeah, for Augustus, it is kind of like this last resort situation just to try and push things along. And it's interesting because it's like you kind of want to know what Augustus is thinking, because he's thinking about this has to have changed over the course of his whole career. Like he wasn't necessarily expecting to come out on top in this civil war situation, but he does.
Or to live.
Yeah, and he's not a well man. Like he has a poor constitution. He spends a lot of time just sort of falling ill, getting well again, and people being like, oh, but we thought you were going to die. And so all of that kind of stuff means that it's playing your cards as you're dealt them. And Augustus's cards sort of just keeps losing cards out of his hand. He's like, oh no.
Wait a second, Dr. G. I just want to get this on tape. Are you saying that Augustus wasn't playing with a full deck?
No comment. How dare you put me in a corner like that? I'm saying he was losing cards fast.
I heard what I heard.
Damn it.
Witnesses.
Well, if there are other questions, now's your time, because I think we've only got a couple of minutes left. But also, thank you so much to everybody who came.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And hopefully we've added a little bit of zest to your day.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, particularly to those familiar names out there. We do recognize some people out there.
Thank you guys, both of you for presenting today. It was fantastic to hear about this. And for everyone who attended, thank you so much. Just a reminder, everyone, there will be an after party after the last keynote. So if you want to hang out with Dr. G and Dr. Rad, feel free to.
Toga party. Yeah, we're ready. Yeah.
No guarantee I'll still be wearing the toga by then, but we'll see.
All right. So, thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
We will be the most awake. It is true.
Yeah.
Yes.
We have just gotten up. We're ready to party hard.